Before we get into virtual cameras too much, I want to just explain how cameras in general work, because it's the same with a real camera as it is with a virtual camera. So I scoured the internet and found on expertphotography.com there's this cool infographic about how cameras work in 3 simple steps, and this really is a good infographic. If you look at the image here, the diagram, you'll see that light comes in through the lens, through an aperture and shutter, and it bounces off this mirror up into our eyes so we can see right through that lens. When we take the picture, this mirror actually lifts up and exposes light onto the sensor, which captures the image. There's 3 things that determine how much exposure or image is going to have, or how light or dark it will be. But each of those 3 factors also affects other parts of the image. The aperture is this small little disc-shaped thing here, and it's either open wide or open only a little bit. That's called the narrow aperture, like an f over 22 wide aperture would be half over 1.4. And you'll see that in 3D Studio Max as well. You can set that. Now, the wide aperture lets in a ton of light, obviously, but it's harder to focus, so it has a shallow depth of field, like you can see in this image here. The narrow aperture lets in very little light, but you can focus over a wide range. Shutter speed is another factor. The shutter opens for a specified amount of time. A slower shutter means more light comes in, but it also captures much of it. And because if its shutters open for 1 second, if there's any motion during that 1 second, it will capture it and blur your image. Sometimes you want this, sometimes you don't. So if you don't want it, you use a faster shutter, which lets in very little light potentially, but it will freeze motion because its shutters only open for 1/1000th of a second, or even less than that. And the third thing is ISO. And the ISO is setting how sensitive your sensor is going to be. So with the low ISO, it becomes less sensitive, but there's less noise. Your image is crisp and clean. On a high ISO, you can do this in low light settings, like at nighttime. As you see in the image, the sensor becomes much more sensitive, but there's also going to be a lot more noise. So you want to try and use the lowest ISO setting possible for the lighting situation that you're in. So these 3 factors come into play with how bright your image is going to be, and we'll take a look at that and how that works and translates into the virtual world in 3D Studio Max. And they've done a good job of trying to make the cameras in there just like real cameras in all of the same settings that will exist. So that's a little bit of the theory behind it. Now let's look and see how it works in Max.